Welcome to the Earth Keepers podcast. This podcast is for people who seek new and better ways to love and care for the earth. It's a podcast for anyone who is deeply concerned about the harm being done to the environment on a local and global level. It's a podcast that builds community and connection between people of like heart and mind, people who believe that earth care should be integrated into every aspect of life, and for many in the Earth Keepers community, that includes our spiritual lives. In today's episode, we'll be talking with Nathan Aaberg, Director of Conservation and Working Lands at the Liberty Prairie Foundation, an organization that's committed to building a world in which food production regenerates the soil and land conservation heals the planet. Nathan lives at Prairie Crossing, a conservation community that respects the environment and enables residents to experience a strong connection between community and the land. A big part of Nathan's work involves equipping and supporting farmers in the American Midwest, farmers who are committed to sustainable, restorative approaches to farming that respect the land.
At times, we are still a minority, a pretty small minority. So about 2% of the American population is in agriculture, and of that 2%, a very small percentage are in sustainable regenerative agriculture. I feel fortunate through the work of the foundation to sort of hopefully have some impact on agriculture that's unfolding in the Midwest. About 50% of the American land area is used for agriculture. So if we want to have a better world and a better environment, better creation, we have to wrestle with agriculture.
Welcome, friends, to the Earth Keepers podcast. Welcome, friends. Today we have two guests, not really guests because James is my sometime co-host. James, how you doing today?
I'm doing great and really excited to be here for today's conversation.
And today's conversation will be with Nathan Aaberg. Nathan, could you tell us what you do day to day, where you spend your time, and where your commitments lie?
So I'm located here in Grays Lake, Illinois, in the heart of the country, and I live and work within the Prairie Crossing conservation community, about an hour north of Chicago. And it's a unique community that was designed and built from like the 1990s, and it integrates a lot of open space, energy efficient homes, trails, and farmland, as well as a lot of habitat. And I work at the local Liberty Prairie Foundation, which is a nonprofit that owns about 94 acres of farmland here within that Prairie Crossing conservation community. We also carry out a number of different nonprofit programs. The one that I'm involved with is called Northeast Illinois Farm Link. That's a program that's designed to connect farmers with landowners and landowners with farmers. Farmers and landowners have a much more difficult time finding each other, and we especially focus on local sustainable regenerative farmers and landowners who are looking for those kind of farmers. So we're part of a mini tribe of people, community up here who are looking to sort of advance agriculture in a regenerative direction.
Obviously, you've devoted yourself to helping others love and respect the land, and I would be curious to know where that passion comes from.
I grew up in inner city Chicago, about as far away from nature as you can be. But my father was a public school teacher, and he really loved kind of having living things in his classroom. There was a number of people who gave me books. I started reading some Wallace Stegner. I'm not sure if you know Wallace Stegner. He's a Western writer. The plot wasn't necessarily about nature, but the paradigm was all about the natural landscape being intimately intertwined with the lives of and hearts of these people. And it's like, this resonates too. My wife, Mayumi, who I met at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, was not brought up really with the Christian faith. But she felt an amazing presence of God when she was out in a natural world. So I came from a more churched background. And so we got into all these struggles around what was our faith life going to be like. She kind of resented it a little bit, but she also recognized that who I was partly as a result of the faith. And one of the things that brought us together was we had this common love for nature. And she's been really a very strong catalyst. She's prevented me from looking away from the wounds of the world. And so we've wrestled with that, and we've had to wrestle with the Bible. And I had to explain to myself and to Mayumi, is the Bible really calling on us to dominate the world in a really violent, parasitic way? Or is there something else there? And that really challenged my faith at the very deepest level. When we're out in creation, your heart is moved. If you're really paying attention, your heart is expanded. And how could so many Christians go along with the destruction of these beautiful places? And so that's kind of what's pulled me through.
Yeah, Nathan, I'm struck by your story in that it feels to me like there's a couple of pieces that are important and that I kind of hear from people who are on a similar journey, myself included, is that we have these moments of connection with the wider world. And I feel like they're invitations to change. And if we accept them, it means doing what you've been doing, which is not look away, because it is an invitation not just into the beauty and profundity of the world, but also the struggle and the suffering. And I really admire you for not turning your back on those experiences and for marrying someone who wouldn't let you turn your back on those. That's a great thing and a gift. You and I met in 2017, but I realized we have some connections that go before that. You started kind of your professional journey, I understand, by volunteering at the North Park Nature Center in the northern part of Chicago, and then worked with the Friends of the Chicago River. And I went to seminary at North Park Theological Seminary, like 2 blocks away. A wonderful place to learn and grow. But then you and I got connected, and you were able to interview me for your blog. And I wanted to have you share with our listeners a little bit about your blog, because you're working out a lot of these struggles there and sharing your heart for the world, your love for Scripture, but your struggles as well. So could you tell us a little bit about your blog and the journey you've been on with your writing?
I came up with the idea of doing this blog because I needed to write. I think I needed to write for several reasons. One was writing is a great way of sort of figuring out what you believe. What are your convictions? How do your convictions match with the world? And so it was like, all right, this is going to force me to sort of wrestle with the Bible, wrestle with the Christian faith, and we'll see where it kind of comes out. I think another purpose was to express some anger and frustration. The title of the blog is Whole Faith Living Earth, which you can find at wholefaithlivingearth.com. And the title, the whole faith part of it, was intended part to sort of say that a whole faith will result in a living earth. But it was also a little bit of a jab to say, I actually think that a lot of people don't have a whole faith. And for a Midwestern Norwegian American, it's really hard to be sort of provocative. It's a really hard thing to do. So that was part of my effort. I also, in my life, have found scattered groups of people who are usually a small minority of their particular church who share these convictions, partly from what they read in the Bible, partly just because of what nature does to their heart. And it's like I wanted them not to feel alone. I wanted them to know that other people care. And one of the things we do in the blog is to interview and profile people of the Christian faith and other faiths who are really taking care of the world. In the end, it was sort of a fire in the belly. I had to do something. Mm-hmm. I had to write, and I was hoping that this would have a wider impact and also allow me to sort of figure out my way. I think a common experience we've probably had is a lot of people feel like the local community of faith they're in doesn't quite resonate with them. That's the experience I've had. But where does that leave us? We end up feeling alone if we're not with a community of faith. And so the blog is also, in a way, sort of a cry for, is there anybody else out there who would love to do community in a different way?
Yeah, as a fellow writer, I know the struggle of getting the words out, both for your own development and to offer something to people. And you've been at it for a while. I'm wondering, as the years have passed, have you seen the response to sort of this call that you've experienced, this hope that you have for a different kind of faith community? Have you seen it shift at all, or does it still seem like it's really on the periphery of people's minds and hearts?
My experience has been is that I hear people resonate with particular posts that I put up. I think sometimes people are surprised. I do get a little pushback every once in a while in some of my interpretations. And I think the challenge for me, I guess, to be very honest, Forrest and James, is that I no longer go to church on a regular basis. It's just been so challenging for me to sort of see all that I see in the Bible and in creation and not to see that represented or addressed or of any concern. So I've really struggled with that. And I think that's meant that I've been more on the periphery, I guess, of religious life. But yet I have a hard time diagnosing, are we heading in the right direction? Or is this just sort of always going to be a small minority of how people of faith live out their faith?
I think the challenge is providing people viable alternatives. And I think there are people around the world, some of whom we've been talking to on the podcast, who are working hard to create those. It's just taking a while to get in the mainstream, but I feel momentum building. Sometimes I wonder if it's building fast enough, but particularly with younger people, if they can hold on to the faith and help us craft a different version of faith, I think there's some real hope.
I'm really encouraged to hear that. Because I know in your interview in 2017, you were sort of challenging me a little bit to sort of say, we can't just walk away from the existing church institutions. We just can't just create new things and let the old things kind of be abandoned. And I think that's true. But I've also seen that within churches, sometimes it's very hard to change the paradigm. You can kind of shift to the committees. You can have some, maybe a little bit of recycling. But to completely shift the paradigm of what the faith is all about is a whole different thing.
Yeah, and I think I would probably nuance my answer now to say it's a both and. We think of Circlewood of having 1 foot in the church and 1 foot out because we need existing communities to adapt and change, and we need pioneers to work on new forms that are going to attract people and just create things that don't maybe carry the baggage of existing institutions and communities.
One of the challenges we have is, what's the emotional tone of these perhaps new communities of faith? Because there's so much that's dire. You and Forrest have talked about this. How do we have hope, but also face the reality? And so what is the emotional tone of a new community of faith around these topics? We're being brought together in part because we're desperate and we're in despair, but then we're also hopeful because of our faith and because we're coming together and sharing that. And one of the things I've been really struck by is the example of the Amish. If you want to look at it sort of a culture that builds in a sustainable form of life, it's the Amish. And yet, when you learn about the Amish, you realize that each geographical community of faith has a slightly different, what they call an ordnung, which is sort of a code of living. This is how we live. I think Americans have a very hard time to be bound by a common set of life habits and life principles. And yet for us to have a culture that's more than just abstract theological beliefs, we have to somehow make this community a community of common habits and common lifestyles. And on one hand, that's attractive to us. On the other hand, it's like, ooh, I want my freedom and I want my Netflix. And it's a little bit challenging.
I know that James has talked a lot with me as of late about, I guess, the power and potential of looking at monastic communities to understand how they did that. How did they join their wills together? How did they live with common purpose and common intention? And I do think that it's really helpful to look at different examples of people groups who have found a way to do it, apparently, and to do it successfully. I'm actually intrigued now to look more at the sort of Amish model that you're talking about. There's a phrase that you used earlier that felt powerful to me, and that was, you're not alone. That's also part of Circlewood's vision for serving the world, is helping people to understand that they aren't alone. It's easy, I think, to feel alone if you're in a Christian context that actually doesn't actively advocate for the earth, doesn't actively work to heal and serve the planet. So I want to laud that part of your mission. And I suspect that there's a lot of people who find hope just because you're saying you're not the only one who feels this way. You're not the only one who doesn't maybe understand where the church is going or can't find a place in the church, at least in its maybe more conventional values these days. I'm wondering, when you do all your talking, your speaking, your teaching, how do you deal with pushback? I'm thinking especially in the Midwest, you might get a good number of people who maybe by culture or by the teachings that they've heard, maybe don't understand that it's possible to be a Christian and actually believe in climate change, to be a Christian and to actually have some sense of responsibility to the earth. What sorts of pushback do you get, and how do you deal with that resistance, really?
I guess it's probably self-selecting. I've not had a lot of people ask me to speak or engage with them who think differently than I do. My father was really good at being an alternative person. He would read the Bible or think about something, and if he came to a conclusion that was unpopular, he was completely fine with it. And so I somewhat inherited that. And so even though I know that there's the preponderance of theological opinion that creation doesn't matter so much, it's temporary. I actually went to a funeral recently for a friend, and the pastor talked about how when Jesus comes again, that'll be the end of life on earth. And it sounded like he was thinking that was a good thing. And it was just so profoundly disturbing and unsettling and wrong from my reading of the Bible that was just very hard to deal with. I've actually had challenges in the past with dealing with conflict. I am a Midwesterner. I kind of like it when people are harmonious. But thanks to my wife in part and having to speak up and practicing my voice and having some challenges over the years, I've become a little bit more comfortable in sort of speaking my own voice. And that's something that needs to continue. I'm a work in progress, and I need to get stronger in terms of being able to speak in a strong way, because I think people respect when you are true to your values. And I think that's what I'm called to do. And I'm hoping that over time, in different ways, maybe I can reach people in ways that aren't theological battles. For example, right now I'm working on a novel that in which I'm trying to incorporate some of these themes and kind of wrestle with them. And I'm hoping that maybe the story is a better way of getting these ideas and convictions across rather than, again, in a theological battle.
Yeah, Nathan, I am struck by how much of what we do sometimes feels like trying to help people think differently, and that there are limits to what we can do in terms of convincing people through the written or spoken word, that there has to be that encounter that you had, Forrest and I have had, and continue to have with the world that draws us closer to the Creator and deeper into our faith. And I'm thinking of a phrase, I think it's a book by Parker Palmer, Let Your Life Speak. And one of the things that you have done is align your life with this journey. And I'm really impressed with the work that you've done. And I think our listeners would love to hear more about the Liberty Prairie Foundation, because you are out there, you're doing it. I find what you're doing really compelling and interesting and forward-thinking. Could you share a little bit more about your work?
I think I can't separate the foundation's work from the community that we're in. So I'm going to talk a little about our work, and then I want to talk a little bit about Prairie Crossing, because that's really a unique place too, which I think has some larger lessons. And when I think about those lessons, I think one of those key lessons is that just changing our individual lifestyles is not enough. And one of the points that Catherine Hayhoe makes is that the reason that we're in the situation we are in is not because millions of households throughout history have always made wrong decisions. It's systems that are in play. And I think someone else says the architecture of the choices we have isn't conducive to living a sustainable life as a community. And that's one of the challenges we have in a modern world is if you are living in a medieval community or an indigenous tribe in Amazon, there was just one way to live. That's what everyone was doing around you. And you didn't have to think about, were you making the right choice with how you hunted or how you gathered food? That was the culture that you had. That's the challenging thing we have in American life, in a modern life, is that there are so many ways of living, and there's nothing that binds us into sustainable living that we can do with just by habit. We own and manage a 94-acre farm, and we use that for a variety of different purposes. One of the things we do is we've had youth education happening on that farm. So during the summer, we've had high school youth come out and learn how to farm sustainably. And also cook with the vegetables that they produce. And it's an ironic thing that people in America can grow up and never have the experience of actually knowing how to actually grow things. And that is an eye-opening experience for some of the youth. Having that common work of having your hands in the soil and being accountable for whether you've picked those weeds or not is really powerful, and it's been transformative. We also make room for beginning farmers who want to use smaller plots of our land. And that's called our Farm Business Development Center. This is a place where they can have access to hoop houses, greenhouses, wash packs to wash the vegetables, a tractor, those kinds of things, without having to pay for all of that themselves. And if you're not coming from a farm family that already has those assets, starting into farming is very hard and very capital intensive. So this is a great way of not just offering them land and facilities and equipment, but it also offers a community. We've been talking about community. Community is so important. Local sustainable farmers are sort of going in a countercultural direction. At this farm, they're surrounded by people who are doing the same thing. And we've found that to be really, really important. And then we also make room for a resident farm family to farm there. So those are some of the ways that we're trying to create habitat and good things in addition to that FarmLink program I mentioned. And I think Prairie Crossing is a great example of how thoughtful design that's different than the typical suburban subdivision can really make it easier to be sustainable and can also encourage others to join and jump on that bandwagon. The development of Prairie Crossing really illustrates several things. The key things is when you're going to do a complex project, it's important to have your principles identified, even if some of those principles and goals are somewhat in conflict. So, for example, one of our goals was to be profitable. Another goal was to be as environmentally sustainable as we could be. And so the most sustainable form of development would be just to sort of maybe have one house and 500 acres. So they had to balance those as well as other factors. I feel fortunate through the work of the foundation to sort of hopefully have some impact on agriculture that's unfolding in the Midwest. About 50% of the American land area is used for agriculture. So if we want to have a better world, a better environment, better creation, we have to wrestle with agriculture.
Yeah, one of the things I love about the Prairie Crossing community is if you think about a suburban vision of the American dream, it's kind of carefully landscaped and lawned homes, maybe surrounding a golf course, which isn't the most environmentally sustainable model. And yet you have developed and live in this community where at the heart of it is a working organic farm, in addition to preserved land to enjoy and take care of. Can you tell us a little bit about what it's like to live there with your neighbors in that kind of vision of community life?
Well, let me start with our own house and then take you out further into the community. So we have a pretty small house. We feel it's actually built the intimacy of our family because we're around each other all the time, which is one of the unintended benefits of having a small house. We've landscaped our area primarily with native plants, and Mayumi grows a great organic garden. She actually just started using cover crops in her vegetable garden this past winter, which is really cool. And so we have like 15 different species of native shrubs. We have oak trees. We just planted pawpaw trees about 3 or 4 years ago, which are a native fruit-bearing tree, which are really awesome. So that's a place where you can do this and feel like you're part of a number of people who are doing the same thing. We walk the trails. And one of the beautiful things about the trails is that you run into other friends and neighbors and have regular conversations. I think we underestimate the power of community as a powerful force that sustainability needs. There's people who have done some really careful research about social infrastructure, and social infrastructure can be the difference between whether people are alone and facing difficult situations or whether they can act together. In Prairie Crossing, they even thought carefully about how much distance there should be between the sidewalk and someone's front porch, because they wanted that interaction. If the porch is too far away, then you're kind of distant and it feels like it's an imposition to sort of talk to each other. If it's too close, the people on the sidewalk feeling like they're being monitored. And they actually thought carefully about that kind of thing. One of the other things that happens is that we have regular work days for the extensive common areas. There's lots of prairies and some hedgerows, some wetlands. And so to maintain those, to keep out the invasive shrubs and to burn, we primarily rely on volunteers. And so the need is for the land to be taken care of. The benefit is that we get to know each other better and we're actually doing something. There's only so far, especially guys, there's only so far that guys can go sitting down and having a coffee. That just only goes so far. When you're working together, it creates a different bond that has really been enjoyable. I've really, really enjoyed it, especially the burning, prescribed burns. Prairies really need burns, and it's great to do that. There's also a lot of community events, and there's just the day-to-day pleasure of being surrounded by prairies and trees and wildlife. Initially, the first people who came to live in Prairie Crossing were very much attracted to the principles of Prairie Crossing, the environmental spirit, the recognizing the sort of the legacy of the past. Some people put down money to buy a home without ever actually seeing the home. What's happened over time is that the people who are really motivated by their values, or like, I'm a progressive, I'm a liberal, I'm an environmentalist, or I'm a conservationist, that percentage of people coming here, I think, has actually declined. And I think what's happened is that because this is such a beautiful place, we're attracting more mainstream people who just love the fact that there is a lake that's also part of the stormwater system, that there are trails, that their kids can be in a place that's really natural. Maybe that's a model or something to think about as we create alternative communities of faith. Maybe at first they're going to seem very intentional and very kind of, strained a little bit at times. But if we get it right, and if it's really attractive, if it offers flourishing people who have values, who are living those out, maybe we'll start attracting a wider audience over time.
I want to push back on something that you said just a little bit ago. You had talked about referring to the first people who settled there. And I know who you were talking about, but it reminds me of a question that we should always be asking. And that is, who actually were the first people in that place? In Circlewood, we've really had to wrestle with that question with the 40 acres that we own on Camino Island. We're really becoming students of history and students of local indigenous people as we try to figure out who actually originally lived here. Because, we need to respect the sort of original habitation, but we also know that there is so much we can learn from people who were indigenous to these places, learning about how to live well with the land, learning how to love the land and respect it. I'm curious if that question has come up, actually, at Liberty Crossing.
I think to this point, we haven't done as much as we should. We at the foundation have been working to sort of figure out which tribes and native peoples were here so we can recognize them. But that's like a very first shallow step. I think we need to do more. And I don't know what that step means, but I think we need to do more for sure. I know there are a number of land trusts here in Illinois that are being really thoughtful. There's one on the west edge of Illinois where they have a number of burial mounds, and they've been actively working with local tribes to sort of make sure that they're handling those well and respectful of that. But I take that really well, Forrest. I thank you for pushing us to sort of be more thoughtful about that.
I think one of the things we can learn from indigenous peoples in North America is along the lines of what you're talking about, is what does it mean to live in community with other human beings, but also live in community with creation, with nature, with all the elements of creation, human and non-human. I do, though, want to say that the thing that is really standing out to me about your description of the life that you're living is this idea of community that is focused on service, community that is focused on a cause. I do think that too often we assume that if we want to be good earth keepers, you got to figure out how to buy better toilet paper or, manage the rainwater from our roof. But it's oftentimes thought about in individual terms, right? And I just think that we don't first go to this question, well, what can we do together? What can I offer to a collaborative effort? how do I find other people who care about the earth as I care? And how can we actually bring our gifts and resources and connections together to actually make something happen? When that does happen, when people are doing earthkeeping in community, they do amazing things, right? And they're changing not just their own lives, they're changing systems. Is that the feel that you get with the work that you're doing?
I think the challenge that there is with this is that people who believe these things are often pretty scattered, geographically scattered. I do feel that community with other people working on these issues in nonprofits around the state and around the Midwest. But again, they're scattered. And at times we are still a minority, a pretty small minority. So about 2% of the American population is in agriculture. And of that 2%, a very small percentage are in sustainable regenerative agriculture. So you're talking about kind of a guerrilla movement almost. And I think there's a lot of longing for that. There's deep longing for that. That's why some of the conferences for organic farmers are so vital, is that it's not just the learning, but it's that community. I guess in the end, I don't know how to answer that other than to say I think people are longing for it and it's a struggle. But when I do have those kind of conversations or those connections with a farmer or with a landowner, and you find that you have common values, it feels so good. Because when they can share their story and they will share it, then they just open up and they brighten, and that gives them the energy they need for another year of farming, which can be so hard.
Nathan, I wonder if you've seen, as I have, that even as you said, only a small percentage of Americans are actively farming, that there are a growing number of farmers either starting regenerative farms or converting their conventional farms to organic farms, and that many of these farmers are actively trying to connect directly with the people in their community through farm visits, community-supported agriculture programs, and other direct-to-consumer products. And I've noticed that a lot of these farmers are people of faith. And I've been involved in farms that do this and found it tremendously helpful in the ways that it has connected me and my family more directly to agricultural practices. Do you see the same trend?
Wendell Berry said that eating is an agricultural act, and that is really true. And you can find, I guarantee you can find some of those kinds of farmers near you. It's really encouraging to see. One of the most interesting things and encouraging things is that some of the most innovative regenerative farmers in the United States are people of faith. And they see their farming as an expression of their faith. And that's pretty darn encouraging and pretty helpful. I could not agree more. If people are looking for a thing to do, a first thing to do and trying to be really good to creation, I would say start thinking about your diet. 3 times a day, you are impacting how the earth is taken care of. And I think it's especially good, especially if you have kids, to make that connection with a farm family and see what that reality is.
So, Nathan, our podcast has people who listen from all over the world, and not all of them are in a place where they can directly connect to farmers. They can certainly think about their diet and how they're supporting the food system. But if you were to address people from the many different countries, in general, what would you say to them in terms of the implications of the things that we're talking about today?
Well, first of all, I would say I would love to learn from them. In many cases, people in other countries are living closer to the land than we are. And I would love to learn what they have found to be helpful and what they're concerned about and what our country needs to be doing better in the world for their benefit. I would say the second thing would be, if you're struggling with the intersection of your faith and living out your life in creation, I would encourage you to think about the fact that living out your life with creation in mind is actually a way that can build your faith, build your spiritual life. You'll become more aware. Your heart's going to become bigger. I think you're going to be called to do things that stretch yourself. And I think faith is about stretching ourselves. It's about living out things that are often going to be countercultural. When you care about the earth, you're going to be going upstream against most cultures that you're in. And that going upstream actually will build your faith. You'll be forced to depend on your faith. And you're also going to find your heart at the same time expanded by both the suffering you see, but also the beauty that you see in the world. And you're going to find people who are of your tribe, who share those convictions, and those relationships will in many cases be really beautiful.
We've been in conversation with Nathan Aaberg of the Liberty Prairie Foundation. You'll find more information about his work and a link to his blog in the show notes for this episode on the podcast webpage. If you appreciate this podcast and want to help us expand its global reach, please share this episode with a friend. You can also show your support by subscribing. Just go to whatever platform you listen to podcasts on and hit the subscribe or follow button for the Earthkeepers podcast. Finally, it would be very helpful if you could leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Stitcher. I'm Forrest Inslee, your podcast host. Our executive producer is James Amadon. Our producer is Dave Olfers. Forrest Reed is our editor and the creator of our original music. Our research assistant is Rochelle Nordman, and Jesselyn Gentry is our social media director. Thank you, friends, for listening. Please join us for our next conversation on the Earthkeepers podcast.